Hello and welcome to this review of my Corsair K70 Core keyboard. This was a donation from Corsair. They later sent me another K70, the K70 Max, which is rather on the opposite end of the spectrum, so to say, and which I'll be reviewing later. I've done several K70 reviews by now, so I guess these two will fit nicely in my lineup. The K70 is a long-running line of popular keyboards, and they sold quite a few of these. It's kind of an institution. It's a bit like the Razer Black Widow. You can find these just about everywhere. So now, in an attempt to market a more economical model, they brought out this Core version as a budget alternative to other, more upmarket K70 models. It also comes with a few modernizations that the aging K70 lacked, which I'll get to in a bit. In principle, I think this is a good move. As I mentioned in my review of the older standard K70 models, it's a pretty board, but it doesn't really offer anything significant that a $40 off-brand keyboard from China doesn't. Many Cherry MX clones are, or at least were at the time, at least as good as the genuine article, if not outright better, and there's nothing else really to make it stand out, so charging premium money for what's really just a Cherry MX keyboard without any real features is a very tough sell, I think. So this being cheaper and using Corsair's own new switches, they finally stepped away from Cherry MX, is in principle a good idea, I think. However, where it kind of falls apart is in how this is executed. And it's done in a really quite adorable way, you know, it doesn't really feel like malice or anything, it's just funny to see what the corporate idea of budget and modernized is. So let's kick off with the price. It's $100 instead of $120 for a Lux and $150 for an RGB, at the time of writing at least. So compared to the standard models, you don't save that much money. I mean, going with a monochromatic backlight instead of RGB is already $30 saved, so for most purposes you really only have $20 between a standard model and this Core version. More importantly, and worse, $100 is obviously not budget. That K8 I reviewed recently is less than $90, and that was a fully equipped, contactless, optoelectric, hot-swappable wireless keyboard from a respectable brand, Keychron, so to ask more than that for a dressed-down keyboard that was already rather basic is a tough sell in my opinion. Granted, the K8 is a TKL, not full size, but still, I think you get my point. It feels like they haven't really looked at the keyboard market in the last 20 years. So normally I talk about what you get for your money, but in this case it might be easier to talk about what you lose for your $20 saved, or $50 if you really want all three of your backlight colors. I've got a standard K70 here. This is a rather old model. It gave away my two Luxes, although I do still have the rapid fire one. Maybe they changed it a bit over time compared to when I last reviewed them, but the basics will be the same. So let's compare the two and see what's what. First, the build quality. It's a plastic box with an aluminium plate insert in the top, with no good means of disassembling it. Now, the full K70 also didn't have that, but its aluminium plate covered the whole top rather than just the assembly space. This top plate, which is brushed aluminium on the K70, gives it strength as well as a really iconic look. The K70 is honestly a quite pretty board in my opinion, especially with just plain red backlight, which works very well with the aluminium plate. Another reason why I think a monochromatic model is a dead easy pick for a K70. So in terms of build quality, this Core version is definitely a step down from a standard K70, and it's very light as well, 0.1091 imperial pints of liquid mercury, or 840 grams for those who measure in normal units. That's not a lot for a full-size keyboard. It doesn't flex that much, so the top plate still does do something, but the whole thing just feels like crap, and you can't even see that it's aluminium. If I hadn't accidentally happened upon that detail on their product page, I never have known, because it just looks like plastic. Of course, if it had been only plastic, it would have been as floppy as a 90-year-old's dick, so it's good that it's there, but it doesn't really help the look at all, nor the feel, really. The K70 Core does, in fact, look, frankly, hideous! I didn't even recognize it as a K70 at first. It just looks so different and really boring, and not in a good way. It's just a generic plastic box, ew. And I don't like these weird slanted corners either. That said, I do think the font on the keycaps is okay. That's not always been the case with Corsair keycaps. Speaking of, the keycaps are very similar between the two. They're both laser-ablated ABS, which is very cheap and non-durable. I have a picture of someone's keyboard, I think also a K70 as it happens, and that shows how badly keycaps like this can wear. And considering how cheap double-shot PBT is nowadays, you'd think they caught onto this by now. Again, this feels about 20 years out of date. So in terms of looks and quality, you're losing quite a lot for your $20. It also comes with a really crappy wrist rest, which is much worse than the one on the other K70 models. It's very flat and not soft at all. It's just a rather hard plastic tread plate. It's better than nothing, I guess. Quite a lot of keyboards don't ship with a wrist rest at all, but again, it's something you're losing over the standard model, which had a soft rubber coating that was much nicer. That said, if you leave it off, you save another $30, which is another easy choice because this is a fucking piece of shit and not worth its production cost, which I'm estimating is about threepence. Now, as far as the modernizing they did, like I said, they still use keycaps that belong in the Stone Age. It's got a fixed rather than a detachable cable, let alone wirelessness. No hot swap sockets, things that are pretty much standard by now. It's got no dedicated media or macro keys. It's very medieval, or Spartan, really. I think what they're referring to with the modernizing thing is that they added foam to the case and lube to the switches, ostensibly to improve the sound, but because they obviously overlooked that you need to design a chassis for sound as well, which they clearly didn't, the resulting sound is actually very powdery and not pleasant at all. I'm not quite sure that this is what people are after, but I'm not an expert on the latest fads either, granted. Maybe sounding like cardboard is actually very in right now. Personally, I'd much rather have actual features and good sound, but I'm not really on Reddit, so I wouldn't know. To back up a little bit, by the way, you might think hot swap sockets are a fad, but it's honestly really good. As an example, I gave one of my friends a K70, but one of its switches is now busted, and because the K70 has no proper disassembly method, replacing it is an absolute nightmare. Whereas in a hot swap model, you could just take it out and replace it in 5 seconds flat without causing damage to the keyboard trying to take it apart, or having to desolder the old switch and solder in a new one, all of which is really rather a palaver. Now, as for the disassembly of this thing, I actually wanted to take a look inside this one, but I couldn't find a straightforward method of taking it apart, and before I started ripping off the feet, which are often not properly replaceable, I figured I'd ask them how to do it, but to my amazement, they refused to share with me how to open the keyboard. I've never heard of that one before. But in that case, it's more important than ever to make your keyboard hot swappable, because how the hell am I going to service it now if something happens? Unlike the lying down volume rollers that other K70 models have, the Core has a standing one. It works fine. I'm not sure which of the two I prefer, to be honest. I think they both have their own pros and cons. Lying down ones are a bit easier to control and generally look better, I think, but I find standing ones are easier to make big changes with and easier to push to mute. Your kilometerage may vary, I guess. Now let's take a look at their new switches, the Corsair MLX Red switches as they call them, which replace the MX Reds other K70s came with. Of course, they're still MX clones, they just did it to offer a cheaper and hopefully better alternative, as Cherry MX itself is arguably worse than most of its clones. Now, I looked up what these are supposed to be, but their product page is a total mess. They harp on it being pre-lubed and call it their smoothest switch yet, which is ludicrous as they also manufacture optoelectric and Hall effect switches, which both easily wipe the floor with these, or really any contact-based switches, so that's complete bullshit. They don't even feel smoother than Cherry MX Red, really. If anything, they feel worse. The product page also mentions that this is a 45-gram switch, same as MLX Red, with 4mm of total travel, but also claim that this is a shorter total travel, and that a shorter total travel means that it's faster and more responsive, none of which is true. 4mm is as standard as can be, and the total travel isn't what determines when a switch actuates, that's the actuation distance, and even then it's a very tenuous point to say that it actuates faster in reality. I even wrote to them about these factual errors, but they didn't do anything about it. It's clear that this department really knows absolutely nothing about the product they're selling. I wonder how many other reviewers picked up on all this, by the way. I haven't seen or read any other reviews, but glancing at the Google search results, others seem to be very positive about this keyboard somehow. I wonder what merit they see in it, because I'm genuinely having serious difficulties coming up with any. Also, 45 grams, my arse, that's definitely wrong. These switches feel way stiffer and in no way like a typical red switch as their product page implies. In fact, I think these feel more like MX Black, which I got on this keyboard here, and maybe they feel even stiffer than them, or at the very least they're quite similar. I asked for the force curve to these switches to see what the hell was going on, and they sent me this one. Now, it shows that these switches have a greater preload than MX Red, but also a lighter end force, so I don't think this ought to feel as heavy as it does, or anywhere near it. I really feel like there's something completely gone wrong here. Finally, the biggest nail in the coffin, these switches are super unreliable, but I mean really, really terrible, as in these are possibly the worst performing switches I've ever come across. Out of just the letter keys, I've already found 5 switches that chatter, which means that they output more than 1 key press per actual press, and that's out of the box, brand new. The worst one is the A key, which chatters like mad. I've even seen it type 3 A's instead of 2. Others include the B, D, S and L keys, so really common ones unfortunately, and I suspect a few other ones of these of chattering as well, let alone how many of these other keys here are chattering. I have no idea. And just to reiterate, I can't replace them because the disassembly is shit and secret, and it's not a hot swap keyboard. See what I mean now? Serviceability is a necessity, people. So, in the end, what is this? It's a budget keyboard, except it's not cheap, just cheaply made. It's a modernized keyboard, except it's 20 years out of date, and it's got updated switches that are vastly worse than the ones they replaced. I should be offended, really, but it's just kind of funny in my opinion. I mean, how out of touch are the people who came up with this? I really find it incredible that they put this on the market as a serious product. I hope I've given their dev team some useful feedback with this video, though. That's it for this review. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this keyboard.